Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into a really monumental decision from the European Commission back in 2012. We're talking about the non-opposition ruling on Google's acquisition of Motorola Mobility. That's case Comp M6381.
And this was a huge test case for competition policy in, the very fast-moving smart mobile device market. This wasn't just about buying a hardware company. It was fundamentally about IP consolidation. Google got its hands on Motorola's massive patent portfolio, something like 7,000 or 8,000 patents, a lot of which were standard essential patents, or SEPs.
Exactly. And that brings us to the central question the Commission faced, and the one we're going to grapple with today. It's this: did the Commission get it right? Did they correctly assess that the risks of Google abusing this newfound power, especially the power from those SEPs, were sufficiently mitigated by, legal obligations and its own commercial incentives?
A huge question.
It is. And I'm going to argue that the Commission's decision was ultimately prudent. Google's commitments and its own profit drivers made anti-competitive behavior, at least in this specific area, commercially self-defeating.
And I'll be arguing the other side, that the merger transferred a really significant and potentially unconstrainable amount of market power to Google, and that the structural risk here warranted much more serious scrutiny than it ultimately received.
So, from my perspective, the Commission correctly focused on Google's overwhelming economic incentive structure at the time in 2012. Google's main goal, it was never to become a huge hardware manufacturer or some sort of aggressive patent troll. Their objective was pretty clearly what they called patent peace. It was about protecting the Android ecosystem, which was, expanding incredibly fast and facing all sorts of patent litigation. And critically, Google's really lucrative mobile advertising and search revenue depended completely on maximizing the distribution of Android. And that happened through diverse OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. The evidence showed these partners, companies like Samsung and HTC, were, and I'm quoting here, considerably more important market players than Motorola Mobility. Motorola's mobile device business actually lost $76 million in 2010. So the economic imperative was simple: protect the ecosystem that's making you billions in ads. Don't try to prop up a struggling subsidiary. And on top of that, Google provided a really powerful enforceable constraint. They issued an irrevocable letter to the standard-setting organizations, committing to honor Motorola's existing FRAND obligations, that's fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. This even included keeping the max 2.25% royalty rate. So that severely limited its ability to just, jack up prices or use those patents to bully people. The constraints were legally binding and, I think, economically compelling.
Okay, I see the points about incentive, but structural power is often exercised when those immediate incentives shift, or, when new opportunities come up. The fundamental problem here is that the acquisition immediately armed Google with market power over standardized technology, these SEPs, where by definition there is no alternative. Every single competitor has to license those patents to comply with the standard.
Sure.
The Commission itself even acknowledged that Google would gain market power and would retain some ability to significantly impede competition, especially by seeking injunctions. So we can't just rely on Google's stated good intentions. FRAND commitments are, they're notoriously vague, and the Commission explicitly said they are not a guarantee that a SEP holder will not abuse its market power. And this risk was merger specific. Think about it. Before this deal, Google had 0 declared SEPs. The day after, they suddenly had this arsenal of patents that Motorola Mobility was already using to sue key rivals like Apple and Microsoft. The danger here isn't just theoretical, it's a very credible threat of litigation designed to force onerous cross-licenses, or terms that competitors would never have agreed to otherwise. And that just slows down innovation. To me, the Commission was far too willing to rely on remedies after the fact, instead of preventing the problem with structural constraints from the start.
All right, so let's start with that first risk you mentioned, the foreclosure risk within the Android ecosystem. You're arguing the structure is the problem, but I'd say Google's financial self-interest, that need to maximize search and advertising, would stop them from favoring Motorola Mobility. Any constant, obvious favoritism would risk alienating the big OEMs who held the majority of the market.
Right.
And that incentive structure is incredibly strong. If Google started degrading Android access or charging higher SEP royalties to, say, Samsung, who is a massive part of the market, Samsung could pivot. The commission found that about half of OEMs would seriously consider making devices with another OS, maybe Windows Phone, which was trying to get a foothold, or even another system like Bada. This competitive threat acts as a powerful check on Google's behavior. The short-term gain of boosting a loss-making Motorola unit could never outweigh the massive loss of ad revenue if they pushed away the rest of the Android market.
I see why you rely so heavily on that profit structure, but I think you're underestimating the market reality those OEMs were facing in 2012. You described the switching cost as manageable, but Android had become the leading global OS. It held between 40 and 50% market share by mid-2011, and market respondents in the case were frequently calling it a must-have input.
It was popular, yes.
More than popular, it was becoming essential. Why? Because market penetration attracts app developers. Developers go where the users are, users go where the apps are. It's a classic feedback loop. And while sure, powerful OEMs like Sony Ericsson or HTC had multi-platform strategies, the cost of fully migrating their key resources away from Android was getting higher and higher very quickly. And besides, the ability for Google to favor an OEM already existed before the merger. They could already interfere with approvals or pick a lead device manufacturer. The merger didn't create the mechanism for favoritism, it created vertical integration. So post-merger, Google controlled the OS, the patent war chest, and the hardware. That bundling of essential elements inherently increases the structural risk, regardless of whether the hardware unit is profitable today. Structural power, once you have it, is often used when the market allows, not just when the quarterly report demands it.
But the commission explicitly studied that risk and found that the threat of OEMs defecting was real enough to be a sufficient break. The dynamic wasn't about everyone switching platforms overnight, but about having a credible, viable threat to scale up alternatives. That puts leverage back in the hands of the big OEMs. If Samsung or HTC even threatened to scale up their Windows Phone efforts, Google stood to lose billions in advertising potential. The financial risk of alienating them effectively neutralized the structural ability to foreclose. The market itself was the remedy here.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for the Android foreclosure risk, but it completely sidesteps the main structural danger here, the SEPs themselves. Those were primarily being used against external competitors like Apple and Microsoft, not Android partners. Let's move to that leverage now. The commission itself noted that Google would retain the ability to use SEPs to extract onerous terms, especially from competitors who didn't already have a cross-license. Motorola was already seeking injunctions against Apple and Microsoft, which, shows a pretty aggressive enforcement strategy. And FRAND is a wonderful concept, but it's incredibly difficult to define in practice. How do you really ensure the terms are fair and reasonable? I mean, we saw disputes over the royalty base. Should that 2.25% royalty apply to the value of a tiny component using the patent, or the net selling price of the entire phone, which is what Motorola historically preferred? These are fundamental disagreements that undermine the idea that FRAND is some simple guarantee of non-abuse.
And that leads directly to the core constraint I mentioned earlier, the SSO letter. I agree, FRAND is complex. It often leads to litigation. But the SSO letter provided a crucial safe harbor. It explicitly guarantees that a potential licensee has the chance to prevent an injunction from even being sought as long as they meet certain conditions. That includes submitting a binding offer and securing royalty payments while a court determines the actual FRAND level.
So it just kicks it to the courts.
It fundamentally limits the coercive leverage. If I am a good faith licensee, I can't be immediately kicked out of the market by an injunction because I can agree to have a court say, the German civil courts, applying the Orange Book criteria, determine the actual fair royalty. It shifts the dispute from market exclusion to a price negotiation inside a courtroom. The commission, I think rightly, determined this significantly constrained the ability to use SEPs coercively.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the promise of a lengthy court battle provides enough protection in a market where product cycles are 6 to 9 months long. The ability to just threaten an injunction, even if that injunction is later blocked by a court, is massive leverage. The threat alone disrupts negotiations, it raises litigation costs, and it can pressure a rival into accepting a bad deal just to avoid the uncertainty.
Trained by the threat of regulatory action. Specifically, the risk of an Article 102 investigation, the EU's tool for policing abuse of a dominant position, that's a powerful deterrent. And we saw that power used later in proceedings against Samsung for SEP enforcement. Regulators and courts are not passive. And let's not forget the balance of power. Apple and Microsoft both hold vast patent portfolios themselves. Google acquired Motorola's patents not just to attack but also to defend. The threat of massive countersuits creates a kind of patent détente where mutual destruction prevents aggressive abuse.
The existence of powerful rivals and the threat of regulatory action after the fact are not the same thing as preventing the structural consolidation of this power in the first place. A single SEP, an individual monopoly, cannot be designed around. Giving control of thousands of them to the gatekeeper of the dominant OS, a company that just a day before held none, was a significant structural change. It created the capacity for Google to engage in opportunistic behavior, and relying on external bodies to police that behavior is a risk the Commission should have minimized, not just accepted.
Which brings us naturally to the final point, the so-called conglomerate effects. The concern that Google would leverage its new SEPs to strengthen its dominant position in other markets, specifically mobile search and advertising.
Exactly.
The initial fear was that Google would use SEP licensing pressure to force OEMs to install Google Mobile Services, a form of tying. But the Commission rightly found this risk was largely irrelevant. Why? Because Google already had incredibly powerful non-merger specific tools to achieve this, primarily the Mobile Application Distribution Agreements, or MADA. For listeners who aren't familiar, MADA is the contract that says if an OEM wants to pre-install popular apps like Gmail or YouTube, they must also set Google Search as the default. That agreement already ensures Google's dominance in mobile search. The SEPs didn't create this ability.
Okay, yes, that's a crucial clarification about MADA. But the SEP acquisition adds a novel and, I would say, dangerous layer of leverage. While MADA controls Android OEMs, SIPs are essential for all mobile devices, including those made by rivals like Apple or Microsoft. The acquisition created the structural capacity for Google to tie the essential patents, which everyone needs, to its highly profitable mobile services. Imagine a cross-licensing negotiation with Apple. Suddenly, Google could bring up the threat of SIP litigation unless the rival accepts a broader deal that favors Google's advertising products. The principle of leveraging foundational, essential IP to strengthen market power in mobile advertising, where Google already had over 90% market share, is a highly valid structural concern that the merger amplified.
But the Commission analyzed that specific tying risk. They found that the ability of the SEPs to drive further foreclosure was strictly limited. The existing high market share was already achieved through MADA. The marginal benefit of adding SEPs to that leverage was low, especially since end users could still download competing services, they could change the default search, they could access rivals through a web browser. The Commission determined that the effect on consumer choice didn't rise to the level of a significant impediment.
You're asking us to rely on end-user choice, but how many users actually change their default settings? Behavioral economics tells us very, very few. This acquisition gave Google control over an essential choke point, the SEPs, which enhances its ability to entrench its existing dominance. Even if the immediate effect on Android OEMs was minimal because of MADA, the ability to coerce broader commercial agreements from external rivals using the threat of injunctions over standardized IP is a structural risk. It fundamentally increases Google's gatekeeper power across the entire mobile technology stack. I think the Commission, in its effort to be pragmatic, missed the long-term synergistic effect of this IP consolidation.
So ultimately, I believe the Commission's decision was pragmatic and well-founded. It successfully balanced the inherent risks of acquiring these SEPs against the commercial realities of the market. It acknowledged the dangers, yes, but it determined that Google's core business interest, protecting that vast and profitable Android advertising ecosystem, coupled with enforceable public commitments on FRAND, effectively limited both the incentive and the merger-specific ability to significantly impede competition.
And while the decision correctly highlighted the need for non-discrimination commitments, I think the analysis relied far too dangerously on future judicial or regulatory intervention to police behavior. The risk of bundling these individual monopolies, these market-essential SEPs with control over the leading operating system, created an unstable competitive structure. The immediate capacity for Google to use tactical injunction threats against major rivals, and the inherent difficulty of enforcing truly FRAND terms, it all suggests that structural changes that consolidate such critical IP should be treated with far greater skepticism. The Commission, I feel, chose expediency over long-term market security.
And this exchange really demonstrates the enduring difficulty in evaluating these huge mergers in fast-moving, vertically integrated tech markets. Competition policy has to navigate that tension between relying on a company's public commitments and its clear self-interest versus the raw, retained technical ability to exercise market power. And there's always more to explore on how policy manages that intersection of innovation and essential patents.